Welcome to you all for this panel discussion hosted by the Armenian National Committee of Canada on war crimes, cultural genocide, and religious freedom. First of all, let me wish everyone joining us a very holy and joyful Nativity and Theophany, and thank you for taking some time to be with us today. My name is Father Deacon Andrew Bennett. I'm a deacon of the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy of Toronto in Eastern Canada, and I'm the director of the Cardus Religious Freedom Institute at Cardus, Canada's faith-based think tank. I also serve there as the director for faith community outreach. I'm a senior fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, DC, and I'm happy to have served Canada as the former ambassador for the Canadian Office of Religious Freedom. So it's wonderful to be with you today, and I'd like to now introduce our three panelists. Beginning with Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou. Dr. Prodromou is an internationally recognized leader on issues of religion and human rights, democracy, and security in Europe and the United States. Dr. Prodromou is currently a visiting associate professor of conflict resolution at the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where she teaches in the program in international negotiation and conflict resolution. She also serves as a curriculum specialist at the Religious Freedom Center of the Freedom Forum Institute. Dr. Prodromou received her PhD and Master of Science degrees in political science from MIT and a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. Next, we have Simon Maghakyan, who is a Denver-based political analyst. He teaches political science at Denver area colleges and consults on advocacy in 18 Western states for a grassroots Armenian American organization. Previously, as an Amnesty International specialist, Maghakyan monitored human rights violations and led nationwide campaigns for at-risk individuals and communities in the former Soviet Union, while concurrently coordinating civics education at Colorado's legislature. In December 2005, after watching fresh footage of the destruction of the medieval Armenian cemetery of Julfa, Maghakyan, then age 19, made it his mission to publicize this vandalism. His efforts resulted in a number of groundbreaking publications and films on the subject. And finally, we're happy to have with us Mr. Artak Beglaryan, who is the current Chief of Staff to the President of the Republic of Artsakh. He previously served as the Human Rights Ombudsman of the Republic from November 2018 until December 2020. He received his BA in Political Science and an MA in Conflict Studies from the Yerevan State University, and he received an MA in Politics, Security, and Integration from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London, and took advanced training in public policy and administration at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. In 2018, he received his PhD in Political Science from the Institute for National Strategic Studies in Armenia. Prior to becoming the Human Rights Ombudsman, he worked in various capacities within the government of Artsakh, serving as advisor to state ministers, as well as assistant and spokesman for the Prime Minister of Artsakh, and he is also a visiting lecturer at the Artsakh State University. So one of the main topics we want to focus on today is religious freedom and how religious freedom can be violated during times of war and times of conflict. So what is religious freedom? When we speak about religious freedom, I think it's important to remind ourselves just exactly what we are talking about. Freedom of religion encompasses many different aspects. It's the freedom to publicly and privately express your beliefs. It's the freedom to worship in peace and security. It's the freedom to share your religious beliefs with others through mission activity, through evangelization, if your religion calls you to that. It's also the freedom to change your religion, and also the freedom to decide that you don't want to have any particular religious beliefs. So it's very all-encompassing. But there are two pitfalls that we find in this day and age around religious freedom, where religious freedom can be diminished. One in particular is to diminish religious freedom merely to freedom of worship alone. So it's okay for people to do what they do in that building over there on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, but once they come outside of that building, whether it's a church or a synagogue or a temple, they're going to be restricted. And we see this most prominently in many Western countries, where we're seeing sort of an attenuation of religious freedom and a diminution to it merely to be the freedom to worship. But it is, as I said, much more than that. The other pitfall is that we reduce religious freedom to somehow just a means of protecting cultural artifacts. And they become sort of these ossified things that don't have any sort of living component to them. And that is also a serious pitfall. Let me illustrate. First of all, let's focus on the destruction of the cemetery in Julfa, which we are marking the anniversary of right now. The destroyed khachkars of the cemetery were and are, for the very few that remain in various dispersed locations, beautiful monuments of Armenian civilization and artifacts of great cultural significance. But why are they beautiful? Why were they beautiful? Is it because of the intricate stone carving of the master artists, or how they were brilliantly illuminated by the sun? This is beautiful, to be sure, but that's not the main reason they are beautiful. They were beautiful because they marked the graves of faithful Christians who were awaiting the resurrection of the dead. Their crosses and images of Christ, the angels and the saints speak to the Christian faith which the Armenian people have truly professed for 1720 years. That's why they were beautiful. The shelling of the Ghazan-Chetsots Cathedral last autumn. The cathedral is a strikingly beautiful church, emblematic of the Armenian style of church architecture. But from where does its beauty come? It's beautiful because it is God's tent, which he has pitched among the faithful of Artsakh. It's beautiful because of what goes on inside it. Praise of God and the celebration of the holy mysteries of baptism, chrismation, Eucharist, marriage, holy orders, and so on. It's beautiful because this is where humanity dwells with and encounters God. This is why the desecration of these sites, or any religious site anywhere, is so hateful and wicked, because it is a grave affront to human dignity. This is why we must speak up to condemn such atrocities and to protect and uphold religious freedom and human dignity, which at its heart is the beauty of human lives as they seek and worship God. And so this conversation we're having today is very important as we go from that very sort of high-level conversation around religious freedom and look more specifically at the current situation, both now and also historically. And so to help us with that, we have these three wonderful panelists. And I'd like to turn first to Artak Beglaryan to introduce himself in a little greater detail, offer a few comments, and then we'll move directly to some questions. Mr. Beglaryan.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. Actually, as far as I understood, I have 2-3 minutes for introduction, yes.
Yes.
On the topic, overall, all of us know that in autumn, Azerbaijan and Turkey started large-scale war against Artsakh. From September 27 until November 9. And during this 44 days war, intensive and aggressive war, I would say, there are lots of war crimes. And this war itself was a crime against humanity. And war crimes included both targeting civilians and civilian objects, and also targeting objects under special protection of international humanitarian law, such as schools, kindergartens, churches, hospitals, etc. But also targeting journalists, using banned methods and banned weapons, including cluster munitions, chemical weapons, phosphorus, etc., engagement of terrorists and mercenaries, and also inhuman treatment cases, very organized in organized nature and systemic nature, against both prisoners of war, civilian internees, and also the bodies of dead civilians and combatants. And all of those war crimes had both deliberate nature, but also indiscriminate nature. Based on our analysis, the majority of them were deliberate. And while talking about the questions and answering the questions, I will give the details.
Thank you. So for the first question, I'd like to get your thoughts on what have been the challenges in recovering POWs from the conflict, and what are some of the resources that the Armenian diaspora and leaders in the international community could use to support these recovery efforts?
Firstly, let's understand what situation we have regarding POWs. We have now 57 POWs and civilians returned to home. The majority of them are POWs, I mean former combatants. I can't say exact number, but over 15, 20 among them, I guess over 15, are civilians who have had been stayed at their homes during the occupation and the invasion of the Azerbaijani and Turkish forces, and they have been captured and then returned to us. But now, even much more POWs and civilians are still kept in Azerbaijan, but without official and formal confirmation by Azerbaijan, by ICRC and Russian mediators. I can't say exact number because it's dangerous to say, but we have analysis at least tens of cases confirmed by videos showing those POWs who have not been confirmed and who are in prisons in Azerbaijan. There are many others missing, civilians and combatants, and we have other proofs, evidence to say that they are captured in Azerbaijan. And these 57 who have been returned, almost all of them witnessed very serious tortures and inhuman treatment in prison and before imprisonment. During the process of capturing, etc. They have witnessed other torturing cases. It means that they have been objects of both direct inhuman treatment, but also they witnessed such kind of cases. That's why they need serious recovery, psychological and physical. Upon their return, all of them have been transferred to hospitals for health recovery. And some of them are still under treatment at hospitals. And there are investigations to understand what happened with them physically regarding to health. but psychologically, psychologists work with them, social workers included, and they are still working with them. But in Artsakh especially, we have still the need of improvement of institutional mechanisms and capacities to meet this challenge and to address their needs. Because I think that they need very long-term recovery, including social recovery, because we don't know what happened with them. We know somewhat, but we guess that there are also some things under curtain. I mean, some I don't know, torture, some compromise, etc., etc. And we have proofs to say that the Azerbaijani side did everything to take compromise and to have them under control, even after their return. That's why we should be careful, including speaking about those things publicly. We should be careful also during the process of recovery.
You had mentioned about the importance of video documentary evidence, and I wanted to explore that a little bit further with you. Social media has really enabled a lot more of user-generated videos that document war crimes. What work is currently underway, Dr. Beglaryan, to document and authenticate these videos so they can be used for future legal proceedings?
Our staff, I mean, I'm speaking about the efforts of the Ombudsman staff. Actually, for 2 weeks already, I'm not Ombudsman anymore, but the staff is still working on this issue and continuing the fact-finding mission. And not only we, but also the Armenian Ombudsman and some human rights organizations and individual advocates are working, lawyers are working on documenting those crimes. We documented not only these war crimes on social media, but also upon return or upon finding the dead bodies under Azerbaijani control, we are continuing our investigation together with investigative bodies to understand what happened with them. We already published a report without photos, but we prepared the same report with photos, which are quite brutal photos, to show the consequences of those war crimes, including beheading cases, including mutilation, torturing, etc. And almost all the cases that we found the bodies, they have the signs and consequences of at least mutilation. In some cases, the investigation showed that they have been killed by beheading or beating or knife alive. I mean civilians. I am talking about civilians. There is larger investigation on POWs and the bodies of our combatants that we found, but this documenting process is ongoing, and I think that in a few weeks or months, together with Armenian Ombudsman, we'll have a large report on this. on those cases. But yes, the social media is also a source of research and documenting and evidence. And it seems that the Azerbaijani side is deliberately publishing by now those videos, and the government and society encouraged not only the war crimes themselves, but also publication of evidence of war crimes. And these are derived from the Armenophobia policy, or xenophobic policy against all Armenians in Azerbaijan for many years. And the government and the society are encouraging this kind of behavior. And the more brutal the videos are or crimes are, the more encouraging and welcoming the reaction of the society is. And since there are tens of, if not hundreds of videos and photos on social media, and in some cases even the identity of perpetrators are quite clear, apparent, but there is no any reaction, legal or non-legal reaction by the Azerbaijani government to say that it's crime, it's banned, etc. It's also a reason to say that this is organized and encouraged by the Azerbaijani government. Also, for example, there is an evidence by a mercenary who is captured. There are two captured mercenaries in Armenia, and Syrian mercenaries, and two of them say that upon their arrival to Azerbaijan, the Azerbaijani officers, commanders, told them that they would be given $100 award per each Armenian head if they behead Armenians. It's also show that the Azerbaijani government encouraged war crimes, including beheading and including with financial ways. And coming to the videos, I would say that the perpetrators mostly are careful to hide their identity. But as I said, in some cases, they are clear. And it shows that they understand that they are doing crimes. They are committing crimes. But they are doing these crimes with accompanying with insulting all Armenians, insulting alive or dead Armenians, civilians and combatants. And this is also showing the basis, the ground, I mean psychological Armenophobic ground of these crimes. And sometimes, for example, there are cases that the Azerbaijani soldier is shooting the video, and another soldier whose identity is clear, face is visible, is cutting off the ears and noses of Armenian dead bodies. And this guy who is shooting the video says that, look, people, this is our hero, and even gives the name of that hero. I mean, he says the name and surname, and says that he He's a serviceman of special forces, Azerbaijani special forces. And many other videos are visible how they are inhumanly treating, beating Armenian POWs. Other videos are visible how they killed, captured Armenian POWs because their arms, their hands are they are handcuffed. In other cases, a few videos are visible that probably they were um, they were victims of sexual harassment because they were naked. Uh, the dead bodies, I mean. But we don't know what happened before or after killing them. There are some videos under international investigation, such as Bellingcat, Guardian, BBC. For example, the first video international investigation was on the Hadrut willful killing case of 2 Armenian captured civilians on October 15. And the Azerbaijani Defense Ministry said that it's fake news. Then a few days later, Bellingcat made investigation and said that it's not fake, this is real video, and gave the details. Later on, Guardian in November, I guess, in the end of in the beginning of December, published an investigation on 2 beheading cases of elderly Armenian civilians. BBC also published a few investigations on such videos. And there is also a report by Amnesty, which is, I would say, is not a professional report because they kept artificial parity between 2 sides. And they are talking about war crimes by both sides, which I can't say which is impossible, but I would say that the proportionality, it's clear that it's very imbalanced, let's say. But for sure, if there are war crimes, even by the Armenian side, all those war crimes should be investigated, and we started a research in order to understand what happened, etc. That's all. As a conclusion, I would say that social media help a lot, but sometimes the perpetrators, not sometimes, in many cases, the perpetrators are already careful and they are somewhat professional as a criminal.
Dr. Beglaryan, thank you very much for the insight you've given to us. And it's very helpful, I think, to our viewers to know in detail what the outcome of that 44-day conflict has been. And I know that we'll continue to be watching. So thank you for your presence with us today. Thanks. I'd now like to move to Simon Maghakyan to give us his perspective on the destruction of the Julfa cemetery, which again, we're commemorating at this time of year. And so Simon, please give us your sort of opening comments and then we'll dive right into questions.
Thank you, Father. It's a pleasure to be among such a wonderful group of scholars and researchers who have dedicated their lives to documenting human rights issues across the world. As you mentioned in your introduction, over the past 15 years, I have spent most of my time looking at Azerbaijan's deliberate erasure of Armenian cultural monuments, specifically the Julfa cemetery, which was the world's largest medieval Armenian cemetery, and also presented the largest collection of cross stones anywhere in the world. But in some ways, Julfa was a window to what was happening deeper into Nakhichevan, because Julfa is situated on the international border with Iran, with a public road that goes by it, which I saw myself in 2013. So what happened in Julfa was a reflection of what happened deep inside that exclave that Azerbaijan controls, where Armenians or international researchers are not allowed access. And in February 2018 or 19 rather, Sarah Pickman, a historian at the Yale University, and myself published this decade-long investigation that documented not only the erasure of Julfa, but the entirety of Nakhichevan's Armenian past that consisted of 89 medieval churches, 5,840 crossstones or headstones, most of which were at Julfa, and 22,000 tombstones. And this happened between the years of 1997 and 2006 under the leadership of Azerbaijan's government, perhaps by direct orders from the president in Baku, but under the immediate supervision of the local autocratic leader in Nakhichevan, Vasif Talibov, who especially in December of 2005, just days before Julfa's final erasure started, gave an order to basically make a list of all the monuments in Nakhichevan for the purpose of showing that there were no Armenian monuments in that region. And this is a land where Armenians had lived for thousands of years. This was part of the historical Armenian homeland, and now nothing remains. And so my contribution was documenting the erasure and looking at it from a political scientist perspective of why and how this was done, and how the world ignored this grave crime against humanity.
Well, why don't we pick up that specific point about how there's been very little attention on the part of the world, and sort of latterly attention on the part of UNESCO. What have they done with respect to the destruction of Julfa? And really, is there any capacity to do anything tangible following this destruction of this cemetery and the other monuments you mentioned? Can anything tangible be done? And if not, what are the alternatives to working through UNESCO?
So, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the destruction of Julfa and the entire heritage of Nakhichevan's Armenian past was a phased campaign. Julfa was not destroyed in the beginning of the campaign because the churches were targeted first and deeper inside Nakhichevan. But in 1998, reports emerged that Azerbaijan had started destroying the Julfa cemetery. Incidentally, they were very careful about it in the beginning. It was not done on site like it would happen in later years. They would take the khachkars piece by piece and transport it by train. And since there was no reason to do so, the assumption was that they were being destroyed, which unfortunately turned to be true. UNESCO was aware of that destruction, and as far as I know, they had sent some note of protest to the government of Azerbaijan. And we saw that the destruction of Julfa in particular stopped in 1998, but it resumed again in 2002 or 2003. And there was a similar attempt, most likely, where UNESCO didn't say something about it, and it stopped again. But in 2005, just a couple of months before starting the final erasure of the Julfa cemetery, Azerbaijan hosted the director general of UNESCO at the time, Koichura Matsoura, in Baku, gave him a medal of glory, and perhaps gave him something else too. We do know that later Mr. Matsoura became officially a part of Azerbaijan's government's one of their think tanks, and was on their official payroll. So the latter part of the destruction was completely ignored, not just by Mr. Matsoura, but his successor, Irina Bokova, whose husband received a $468,000 consultation fee from Azerbaijan. She said it had nothing to do with how she treated Azerbaijan, but she also, on behalf of the organization, took a $5 million donation from the government of Azerbaijan. And to this day, UNESCO has failed to condemn the destruction of Julfa publicly. In fact, last month, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty had a major story on the 15th anniversary of Julfan's erasure. They reached out to UNESCO, and UNESCO failed to even condemn it. They made a blank statement. And so given their record with ignoring the destruction of Julfa and the entire heritage, all the 28,000 monuments of Nakhichevan, and the pressure they got after my investigation, co-authored with Sarah Pickman, came out in 2019, it gives me little hope that they will be doing anything to redress what happened in Nakhichevan. And so my mission in some ways has been to do what UNESCO did not do, which is at least do the truth-telling, the documenting part of things, because Azerbaijan not only erased those monuments, but also said that they never existed to begin with. So a small measure of justice is perhaps at least telling the truth about their existence and their erasure that UNESCO has chosen not to do.
Well, this is so essential. The revealing of what happens for the historical record, and also in the defense of truth. And we can see this in so many cases throughout recent history, where there have been attempts to cover up things that have happened, despite clear documentary evidence that they did happen. And this is certainly something that the Ukrainian community has done with the Holodomor, the enforced famine under Stalin, and certainly the destruction of churches and other things that took place during the Soviet regime. So certainly there's a lot of parallels across communities. And so the work you're doing is so critical, Simon. What can we learn about what has come since Julfa? What have we learned about how culture can be lost, particularly how culture can be lost and has been lost in the present conflict in Artsakh? And maybe you just comment on that. What is the lesson of Julfa?
Well, the lesson in Julfa is not an encouraging one. It seems to tell us that a powerful country with resources that it's willing to use to mute international reactions, a country that is willing to destroy cultural heritage on its territory, is able to do so, and most likely they will get away with it. Of course, there's sovereignty of countries and territorial integrity, and even the notion of responsibility to protect for civilian populations. It has not been used very much by the international community. We saw in the latest conflict, the latest war, the Armenian-Azerbaijani war of 2020, when the duty, international responsibility to protect civilians was not sought by the international community in protecting the civilians of Artsakh or Nagorno-Karabakh against Azerbaijan's aggression, regardless of whether they see those citizens, the civilians, as subjects of Azerbaijan or not. So there's little hope that monuments will somehow, and I certainly hope monuments will not be considered more important than human lives. But given that there is no real effective international duty to protect civilians, there doesn't seem to be an international duty to protect cultural monuments. And in fact, that's how UNESCO is set up. It's an intergovernmental organization. So a lot of its decisions are made by committees that consist of member states. And a lot of times the motivation of member states of China, Saudi Arabia, and Azerbaijan to be involved, to be leaders, is not to protect cultural monuments, but to increase their own soft power and perhaps cover up their own violation in the fields that they're supposed to promote. And so there isn't really an international mechanism, and the cultural destruction that happened during the war in Artsakh and that is happening in the occupied areas where Azerbaijan has control now, like in Hadrut, much of the hope is for Azerbaijan to unilaterally be a responsive player and see monuments not as threats to its identity, but to use the preservation as a means of cultural diplomacy to perhaps establish positive peace and give peace a chance in the long term, which would come from a place of wisdom. From an international perspective, I guess the biggest thing that UNESCO could do was to offer to help, which they did recently under their new leadership. And Azerbaijan was very upset with UNESCO basically criticizing Azerbaijan because UNESCO said that Azerbaijan has not responded to calls for cooperation in this regard. And perhaps there could be some bilateral monitoring of sites that the Armenian side should initiate. But to answer again your question of what is the lesson of Julfa, it's not an encouraging lesson. It's a lesson that power holders, that countries can basically do whatever they want with the heritage on their territory, and unless the targeting of monuments fits some sort of a global narrative that the superpower like the United States is willing to use for its own political agenda, we're not even going to see media coverage of what's happening. I'm alluding to the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, about which we really learned because the United States was invading Afghanistan. I'm alluding to the destruction of Assyrian, Yazidi, and other shrines by ISIS that we learn about because the United States was in conflict with ISIS. So it's not, there's not much hope for protection of cultural monuments, but this doesn't mean that we, as non-state actors, researchers, activists, and other groups should stop the fight for preservation and looking for perhaps creative solutions for preservation.
And I think, as you've pointed out, these are certainly monuments, but they're not monuments to a dead community, but monuments to a community that continues to live in these areas. The Armenian presence in this region goes back almost 5,000 years. And to sort of see that by, destroying these important monuments, that there's somehow a way to get rid of the community is really naive. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could just, maybe as a final question, just try and connect for our viewers this idea of the role of monuments, the role of whether we're talking about an ancient cemetery or whether we're talking about a church that people continue to worship in, the importance of place, the importance of monuments, the importance of churches to a living, vibrant community that continues to inhabit a very dangerous geopolitical area.
Yeah, that is a great question, and perhaps folks who come from similar backgrounds like Armenians, maybe Assyrians and Yazidis, the indigenous peoples of the Middle East, there is not necessarily a need for an explanation of what those monuments mean, but perhaps for a Western audience, it is important to go into detail of the connection with your ancestors that you feel through those monuments, that the history that the monuments bear for you, and you oftentimes don't separate yourself from the monuments that where you worship, but also that you worship. So perhaps this may be strange for Western Christianity, but for Armenians, the churches are not only houses of worships, they're also objects of worship. And perhaps this may not, be in line with mainstream theology, but that's what happens when, people who've lived in that land for thousands of years and see monuments as part of themselves. They are part of the community. They're your direct link to the ancestors, but also they're guarantee that of your future generations, that your offsprings are going to carry on your cultural traditions, your faith, your your historical lineage. And so when, two French authors, I think, said it best, where, they described why Armenian monuments have been deliberately targeted through the centuries, but especially during and after of the Armenian genocide. And they said those monuments are the strongest expression of Armenians' ancestral roots. And I think that is true for any indigenous community, Pontic Greeks in Anatolia, Assyrians, Yazidis in Mesopotamia, and cultures across the world, where a lot of times they're, just like the women were targeted for sexual violence as a way to not just target them as individuals, but depress and demoralize the community, the same way monuments who are also sacred to everyone were targeted. So that is why it's so important for Armenians and Azerbaijanis to find a way for the cultural preservation of monuments in the region, especially if there's hope for long-term peace. Monuments will be key, the way they're treated. And despite what Azerbaijan did in Nakhichevan, doing this unimaginable, unmatched erasure of 28,000 monuments, every piece of it, there's not even their dust remains. Hopefully the Azerbaijani government will see cultural diplomacy as a way to create peace in the region, because this is not just to be good neighbors. This is to make sure that there can be peace in the region and across the world. And so I hope that will be something that both state and non-state actors will contribute to, and I hope people watching this program will value not only the history of the monuments and their presence, but also what they can do for the future.
I think just one final point that I would make, I think your reference to these communities as the indigenous peoples of this region is very important. And I think especially for our Canadian viewers who are very cognizant of the process of reconciliation we're currently undergoing with our own First Nations and indigenous people in this country, that when we speak about indigenous communities, we tend to have a very sort of American focus, whether we're speaking about North America or South America, and the impact of European contact with indigenous communities that we are now becoming, I think, thankfully, finally, very, very aware of the impact that has had. We cannot forget that indigenous communities exist throughout the world. And we look at the indigenous communities that you've referred to, Simon, whether we're speaking about the Armenians or the Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, Yazidis, and so forth, that these communities have also experienced the effects of colonization, and they continue to experience significant persecution in a variety of different ways, as we've seen over the last decade, particularly in Iraq and Syria. And so when we speak out in defense of indigenous peoples, and we look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have to remember the breadth of challenges that many indigenous peoples face around the world. And I think that's very important. So thank you for raising that. So, and for your thoughts. I'd like to now move to Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou. Dr. Prodromou, if you would just maybe offer a few opening comments, and then we'll move right into questions.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Father Ambassador Bennett. And thank you to the Armenian National Committee for the very generous invitation to be part of today's conversation. And I commend you for raising the issue of cultural heritage over and over again, so that we can begin to understand how cultural heritage protection and preservation is so connected to what Father Andrew mentioned at the beginning, freedom of religion or belief, or international religious freedom. As a sort of set of general observations, I would say that my interest in cultural heritage stems from my broader interest in the non-violent forms and mechanisms that are used to violate freedom of religion, conscience, or belief. And having served on the US Commission on International Religious Freedom for 8 years, traveling around the world and seeing the different mechanisms that states and also non-state actors, but in particular that states use to violate the religious freedom rights of vulnerable communities, it became very clear that these kinds of violations happen continuously in times of nonviolence. And I think our previous two speakers, Artak and Simone, beautifully highlighted the way in which violence and conflict produces destruction of cultural heritage. But I think the international community, and certainly we, the global citizenry, oftentimes miss the ongoing destruction of cultural heritage and the associated human rights violations that happen when there is an absence, or at least a visible absence, an absence of visible violence. So I'd like to sort of highlight that. And I think that's very important in terms of the work that I do as an academic at the Fletcher School, in terms of promoting religious literacy. We have an initiative on religion law and diplomacy that is aimed at developing the religious literacy of our students as they leave the Fletcher School to become policymakers or practitioners, or work in the private sector, and recognizing the intersection between international religious freedom, the broader basket of human rights, and also cultural heritage is something that figures into how we develop, broaden, and deepen our religious literacy. I've done a lot of work on Turkey over time, and I say this because many people may ask, why Turkey? And I think it's important for this discussion that we're having today to underscore the fact that Turkey's policies, cultural heritage policies, I would say, when it comes to the destruction, either appropriation, expropriation, or destruction of cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, started domestically, but has been internationalized, and I would submit is becoming globalized. And certainly in the case of Artsakh, we've seen that through active and indirect measures by which the Turkish state has supported the government of Azerbaijan in what we heard about, but also in terms of the case of Turkish occupied Cyprus, occupied since 1974, no active conflict, but the process of cultural heritage destruction there has been comprehensive and systematic. And now we're seeing it in northern Syria as well, that part of Syria under occupation by Turkish troops and or their proxies. So the point here is that what begins as a domestic policy in Turkey is being internationalized. And Turkey in that regard, I think, is very instructive when states deploy more and more purposefully and actively what Simone mentioned, that is soft power tools. And cultural heritage and religio-cultural heritage is part of the toolkit of states that can either contribute to human solidarity and to universalization of cultural heritage, or quite the opposite. So that's why I think Turkey is especially important, because it is so instructive. And after all, it's a NATO member state and a candidate country for EU membership, and presumably respects international law.
I think this is a really crucial issue to explore. And so, Elizabeth, I want to touch maybe first on an event that took place in the last year that is very much at the forefront of many of our minds, especially those of us that come from the Byzantine tradition. And so I'm wondering if you could begin by explaining Turkey's historic misuse and appropriation of the Church of the Holy Wisdom, known as Hagia Sophia in Turkey, and how does this characterize Turkey's broader mistreatment of Greek and Christian sites around the country? You've already alluded to this domestic issue. And then maybe you can speak about, a little bit more detail, Turkey's policies and underlying philosophy when it comes to the cultural heritage appropriation and also destruction of its Christian communities domestically.
Okay, sure. I think, it's been 6 months now since the July decision in 2020 that the Turkish state announced that it was going to reactivate the what was then the museum of Hagia Sophia into a mosque. And that was the next month followed by the announcement that the same would be done for the Hora Monastery of Christ, the Cardus monastery, which was made into a mosque and then a museum. And I know everyone is familiar with that, but media cycles are maybe like, 1 day long, if that. And so just as a reminder, and I think what was especially important about, and tragic, of course, about those two cases is that it brought to light a state cultural heritage policy that was established with the foundation of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. And indeed, I would submit that until the Hagia Sophia decision, there was almost no international, certainly no international media attention to it in terms of mainstream media, as well as media dealing with issues of freedom of religion or belief, or with media that is interested in the geopolitics of Turkey's place in Eurasian and global politics. So the decision in 2020 to revert those two sites, formerly museums, to active mosques, was based on the Turkish High Court's ruling that the sites should be returned to their original heritage, they should purpose. They should function according to their original purpose. Now, we know those were as Christian sites, then they became Muslim mosques, and therefore the museumification of these two sites in some ways was the first step towards them being recognized and ultimately inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So sites that, notwithstanding their original founding purpose, their evolutionary purpose, ultimately became understood as sites of importance to the global community. And I think at a time when we're all still living through the COVID-19 pandemic, this notion of universality, from local religiously specific sites to cultural heritage that is for all the world, probably should and does resonate with all of us. So those decisions were taken, and indeed the Hoarder Church decision had been taken in November 2019 with absolutely no reaction from the international policy community or the media. But the decisions were taken, and those are now sites that are actively functioning as mosques. And they are, as I said, part of Turkey's cultural heritage policy that draws from the well springs of the founding conditions of the Republic of Turkey, when Mustafa Kemal mobilized a cross-disciplinary cadre of state-supported professional intellectuals who were dedicated to, and they were charged with creating a new national identity project for Turkey, expressed under the moniker of the Turkish historical thesis. And cultural heritage was recognized by the Turkish state as intrinsic to building an exclusivist, homogenized form of nationalism with an anti-pluralist logic that would, through violence and certainly through non-violence, would write out, would eliminate, and would erase the indigenous populations, the Greek, Armenian, and Syriac Christian populations that inhabited Anatolia long before ethnic Turks arrived from the Turkic peoples arrived from Central Asia. And over time, the management of Turkey's cultural heritage policy has fallen under the purview of the Diyanet, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the ministries, both the Ministries of Culture and Tourism, and also some input from the Vakiflar, the Ministry of Foundations. But certainly since 2002, it's been the Diyanet that has been increasingly mandated to centralize and control and drive all of the state's cultural heritage policy. And the Diyanet has enjoyed massive budgetary increases under the Erdogan government as part of the Erdogan government's policy of neo-Ottomanism and the reconfiguration of Turkish national identity according to hierarchies of communities, Sunni Muslims, non-Sunni Muslims, and all others, non-Muslims, and that means Christians, Jews, and other tiny communities. So we're talking about a century-long project, and indeed we're approaching the centennial of the Turkish Republic, that has used cultural heritage as a means to appropriate and expropriate the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of now very vulnerable, tiny, at-risk communities, such that they have lost control over their own history. As the living communities become more vulnerable, the cultural heritage presence, and we're talking about, in the case of Christian communities, churches, monasteries, libraries, museums, cemeteries, anything that gives physical expression to the existence of those communities, those have now been absorbed, appropriated, and reconfigured and repackaged by the Turkish state.
I know that these communities, whether we're speaking about the Greek community or the Syriac community down around Mardin, or the Jewish community, especially within Istanbul, they all live in this great hope that these buildings will be restored to their communities. And I know in my own engagement as ambassador for religious freedom with the Diyanet in Ankara and raising these questions, there is an absolute unwillingness to talk about them, and an absolute unwillingness to consider the restoration of these properties. And so it's very much, fits in with the narrative you've just described, Elizabeth. And that raises obviously the question, and you've already sort of highlighted it, is what is the international response to this, and what can be done? And it's certainly a question that I posed to Simon as well in the Armenian case, in the case of Artsakh. But what has been to date the international response to the misappropriation of Hagia Sophia? And what can we expect from, again, UNESCO, other international bodies? I'm going to extend the question a little bit. What might we expect from national governments that might seek to put pressure on Turkey, perhaps even those that are NATO allies?
Sure. Thank you, Father. I think the international response has been interesting, but I would say disappointing, because it's been far more rhetorical than action-oriented, and in seeking mechanisms to either encourage or require impose penalties so that Turkey will comply with its international treaty obligations, and particularly where Hagia Sophia and the Hora monastery are concerned. The Turkish state's unilateral modification of the legal status, the name, and the structure of those two sites is a direct violation of Ankara's responsibilities under the UNESCO World Heritage Convention of 1972. So UNESCO has been very active in its rhetorical criticisms of Turkey, reminding the Turkish state that according to the World Heritage Convention, those two sites inscribed therein, that Turkey was required to give prior notice of modifications to the sites. And extensive modifications have already taken place, by the way, in both sites. In terms of the Hagia Sophia, things that I think many people have seen on social media and other sites, covering of icons and frescoes, the use of the minbar, the laying down of prayer rugs, which changes the acoustics of the site, all of the things which make the site, in fact, such an architectural and religious and spiritual, and for those who have no faith commitments, again, an architectural and a cultural monument that has universal value. So UNESCO has been very critical. The UNESCO Secretary General has also instructed the special envoy for UNESCO to Munir Bushanaki to visit Turkey, and that was in 20 of December, and to submit an official report on changes to the sites with recommendations by the end of February to UNESCO. At the same time, there have been, widespread criticisms by states from EU member states, including Bulgaria, France, Germany, Greece, Spain, but also with other European states as well, critiquing the action. We also see criticisms from the United States and Russia, from Armenia, Australia, the UAE, Egypt's Grand Mufti from Al-Azhar condemned the changes. And I mention this because it's very interesting to see that regardless of regime type, whether we're talking about democratic or authoritarian states, regardless of religious demography, whether we're talking about, highly diverse religious demographies, or Muslim majorities, or Christian or Buddhist majority, there's been a kind of universal response to this action. Some might argue cynically because of the geopolitics of Turkey's actions, but other might, and I would submit it's both, beyond geopolitics, it's also a recognition that there is a kind of global phenomenon underway where vulnerable or minority, if you will, numerically minority communities are seeing their cultural heritage be expropriated altered and destroyed. And again, underscoring the fact that those communities are small in numbers or vulnerable in terms of their sustainability, the cultural heritage is what remains. And then finally, other responses. The outgoing U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made a visit to Turkey and met with some of Turkey's religious minority community leaders, including the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But in terms of action, I would say until now, the actions have been quite limited. And I think we can see the impact of those in terms of what Simon and Artak mentioned earlier, which is that because there have been no compliance penalties imposed on Turkey for what it's done, the Turkish state, like any state, calculates that there are no costs to its own interests and also to its own soft power and international reputation from undertaking these kinds of actions. And hopefully the report that will be submitted by Mr. Bushinaki and also upcoming, we're hoping, visits by UN Special Rapporteurs, freedom of religion or belief, on minority issues, on cultural rights, and also on the promotion and protection of the rights of freedom of expression and opinion. The Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in America requested that those special rapporteurs visit Turkey. Hopefully those visits and reports will lead to policy recommendations that are concrete and which will be implemented.
Coming back to, again, this whole question of soft power, and we can maybe extend it out and say very negative use of soft power. You spoke about the exportation of Turkey's policies and underlying philosophy around cultural heritage and how Turkey has appropriated and destroyed, the sites of its Christian communities. Why should the international community be specifically concerned about the exportation you spoke of, to northern Cyprus, northern Syria, Artsakh, especially given how the International Criminal Court has viewed these types of actions?
I think this goes to the question of cultural genocide, which is a term that is in fact highly contested, but it has roots that are almost 8 decades old now. The term was coined in 1944 by Raphael Lemkin, and he understood it as a component of genocide, the multifaceted processes that comprise genocide. And here again, I think it's crucial to go back to this distinction between violent and non-violent, because soft power and the projection of soft power and the use of religious and cultural heritage policies by states who are interested in erasing or appropriating cultural heritage most often takes place in the form of nonviolence, or oftentimes follows violence with nonviolence. And cultural genocide speaks to that intersection between violent and nonviolent behavior. And I think it's worth emphasizing that when it comes to cultural genocide, notwithstanding the contestation of the term, it's one of those things that when we see it, we know it. When we recognize it. Unfortunately, there are no hard metrics that can help the international community for reaching definitive conclusions about how to define cultural genocide. How many sites must be destroyed until it reaches a threshold, and in terms of intangible practices, for example, the forbidding of communities, the literal silencing of individuals and communities when it comes to speaking their own language. We saw the Franco regime do this with the Catalan language in the previous century. We have seen Turkey do it with its Kurdish population in the 1980s and 1990s. I mean, that's language is intangible cultural heritage, but if you can't speak your language, you can't transmit it intergenerationally, it becomes difficult to write about it. And for next generations, it becomes easier for them to forget. And I think that's the key component here when we talk about cultural genocide as what the Armenian Genocide Museum defined as acts and measures undertaken to destroy nations or ethnic groups, and I would add religious groups, culture, through spiritual, national, and cultural destruction. The fact is that these nonviolent mechanisms, they contribute to a process of erasure and memoricide. And scholars have written about this, and I've certainly, spoken about memoricide. Once living communities have disappeared, what may remain of them are these physical expressions of their long history and their presence. And if those physical expressions are either destroyed, or if what once was a museum, or in the case of China now, a mosque, in its treatment of the Uyghur Muslim population, this knows no religious or confessional boundaries as practice. What we see is that people don't recognize what they're seeing. And so the memory of those once living communities is forgotten. Libraries as well, museums as well, the destruction of those as cultural heritage sites means that the written expressions, the artistic expressions, those have been literally erased, and they are not transmitted intergenerationally. What was alive and measurable and visible becomes an abstraction, hopefully born in terms of memory, but oftentimes lost and forgotten. And so I think the perniciousness of a cultural heritage policy that is deliberately designed not only to destroy, but to repackage and to reappropriate helps to advance that process of memoricide and forgetting. And it also contributes to the historiographical project, the rewriting of history that also underscores forgetting or the perpetuation of factual inaccuracies and untruths.
Let me extend that out just in one final question. Elizabeth, you spend quite a bit of your time at the Fletcher School in forming young adults in religious literacy in this project that you have there. And I know from my own experience that often when we try to engage policymakers on these questions and to come up with a thoughtful foreign policy response to respond to whether the atrocities in Artsakh or whether we're dealing with the non-violent means that we've seen the Turkish government use over the last century plus. One of the big major challenges is ignorance, that a lot of our policymakers just are not formed. They don't have the educational background to address questions of religious patrimony or religious practice that informs how these communities live. And really through no fault of their own, it's sort of a factor within the public education system that there's no discussion really of religion. And there's not a lot of conversation around why these people do what they do, how they worship, why these buildings are important, why these cemeteries are important, and so forth. So maybe just as a final point, I'd like to get your thoughts on this question of ignorance and what can be done from an educational perspective in terms of religious literacy and literacy around religious freedom. What can be done to ensure that in future we have policymakers, foreign policy actors that are just better equipped to deal with these situations when they arise, so that instead of being sort of ignored or not getting the attention they deserve, there's actually a cadre of well-educated, well-formed people who say, yes, I understand what's going on in Artsakh. I understand what the Turkish government is doing. And so therefore there can be a really thoughtful and forthright foreign policy response. I'd just like your thoughts on that.
That's a great question, Father. I guess I would emphasize just a couple of points. First of all is, I think in terms of higher education, the importance of continuing to mainstream the study of religion. And what do I mean by that? Or, take religion out of enclosed departmental or, disciplinary spaces, so that the study of religion isn't simply limited to departments of religion or religious studies, or even to seminaries. That, as we assume that people will study economics or study politics, they will study religion. Religion is a powerful force, both for good and for violence and conflict in our world, and it's part of the world in which we live. So I would say the de-siloization of religion, if I could use such a cumbersome and not real term. And I think at the Fletcher School, because it is a school for hybrids and it's a cross-disciplinary graduate school, centering religion as part of the whole menu of intellectual and practical options available is something that is necessary, and the school has been supportive of that. That increases religious literacy. I also think another important point at the policy level is to speak to state makers and about this siloing issue, and to recognize that hard security and geopolitical questions cannot be separated from human security questions, like the ones we've been talking about, because stable security environments and rule of law depend not only on hard security questions, but on human security and the sustainability of communities. So bringing together policymakers who understand that their hard security and their human rights and religious freedom questions and economic development questions, because parenthetically, one thing I think is crucial is the use of property rights to disenfranchise vulnerable communities has been certainly a tool of choice for the Turkish state when it comes to cultural heritage. But again, it's universal. So bringing together policymakers across sectoral lines and lines of expertise to think about hard and human security. And then finally, last point, the depoliticization and the departisanization of religious freedom, freedom of religion or belief, and international religious freedom. We're talking about universal human rights. And so regardless of the state that we may be discussing, and Father, you can speak to this in the case of Canada, I can in terms of the case of US, these are universal commitments. They don't belong and they're not owned or rejected by any party. They should be a multi-partisan, bipartisan set of commitments that states bring to bear, and don't politicize them in terms of domestic politics, which undermines the capacity of states to take efficacious, meaningful action internationally and bilaterally.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that last observation, Elizabeth. And let me just take this time at the end to thank very much our panelists. So I'd like to thank, first of all, our Artak Beglaryan, who was with us from Artsakh. And I'd like to thank Simon Maghakyan, who gave us some really good insights into his work on the Julfa Cemetery and broader questions of the implications around that action. And finally, to my good friend, Dr. Elizabeth Prodromou, for her always excellent insights on these questions of religious freedom and how we have to be very vigilant in how we understand both the exercise of soft power and hard power, violence and nonviolence, when it comes to the rights of especially minority religious communities. So thank you all very much. And a final word of thanks to the Armenian National Committee of Canada for putting together such an excellent panel. I think it's very timely, and we should certainly be doing more of this, especially as we seek to engage policymakers and foreign policy actors to respond in an efficacious and coherent manner when these types of conflicts happen. So thank you again very much to all of you, and wish everyone, including all of our viewers, a very happy and blessed new year. Thank you.